Welcome to the Whitmercast, a podcast by the John Whitmer Historical Association. We bring you essays, interviews, panel discussions, and broadcasts related to Mormon history and restoration studies. My name is Katherine Pollock, and I'm currently a master's student in religious studies at Missouri State University, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in. We have a great episode lined up for you. We'll be talking to return guest Kyle Beshears. If you'd like to join JWHA or visit our entire backlog of episodes and JWHA journals, go to jwha.info. With that out of the way, let's get started. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Kyle Beshears. He is an independent scholar and is currently on the JWHA board. His newest book is 40 Questions About Mormonism, released in February 2026. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Catherine, thanks for having me on. This is a joy to be back.
So I'm excited to talk to you about 20 Questions About Mormonism and the evangelical Latter-day Saint dialogue in general. But first, could you give us a little bit more background about yourself?
Yeah, I am, as you said, an independent scholar in Latter-day Saint history primarily. So I specialize in James Strang and his movement. I did my dissertation on Wingfield Watson, who was instrumental in sustaining Strang's movement after his death in 1856. And I've presented and published on that topic. So this topic, 40 Questions About Mormonism, as an introductory book to Mormonism, generally speaking, is a pretty big change for me. I really had to widen the aperture as wide as possible for this project.
So, why did you decide to write 40 Questions About Mormonism, or how did that happen?
Yeah, I was actually approached by the publisher through the general editor of the series. So 40 Questions About Mormonism is a part of a larger series published by Kriegel Academic called 40 Questions About. So you have 40 questions about the Apostle Paul, 40 questions about eschatology, 40 questions about women in ministry. So these are theological, biblical, or ministry related topics. And the book series is meant for primarily for evangelical seminary use. So for us, seminary is graduate school, and it's typically where ministers or pastors would train prior to being called to a church or to the mission field. So it's typically where you'd hear maybe the term Master of Divinity is where that's where we get ours. So this series is intended to be introductory for graduate students, but also to hit lay folks that might be interested in these topics as well. So you kind of have to talk to two audiences at once, if that makes sense. So the publisher, like I said, through the general editor, reached out to me because they wanted to broaden the series a bit and start to include religious perspectives that are not evangelical. So they've had one on Islam, they had one on Roman Catholicism, and the next one they wanted to do was Mormonism. And I just happened to be the one that they called up to see if I would be interested in writing it. And of course, it delighted me to be able to accept that. And me personally, the reason I agreed to it, because I'd always imagined myself writing first in this field on Strang's movement. But there was a gap I felt needed to be filled in literature written by evangelicals on LDS history and practices and doctrine. And that gap is to write a non-polemic, non-apologetic resource for people to see Mormonism through the lens of a traditional Christian who's not necessarily trying to persuade, but to inform. So the goal of this book is for readers to don the lenses of a traditional Christian who's looking at the story of Mormonism and uh, its statements of theology and doctrine and its practices. Some things overlap a lot and other things don't. So how might a traditional Christian look at, say, the existence of temples and the endowment ceremony, yet without the impetus of trying to debunk it or persuade people otherwise, which has been pretty much the standard from our tribe writing about Mormonism.
I want to get into some of the history here about evangelical and Latter-day Saint dialogue. What are some older examples of it that you know about?
Yeah, so if you know Latter-day Saint history and the relationship of Latter-day Saints with evangelicals from the beginning, it's been fraught with tension, contention, and even violence at times. Probably the episode people are most familiar with would be Joseph Smith's first vision, in which he breaks from traditional Christianity and starts the Mormon movement, right? And from that time forward, there's always been a contentious relationship between evangelicals and Latter-day Saints. But it hasn't always been like that. There were points in history that I found that Latter-day Saints invited what today we might call evangelicals to come speak. I found one example of a German Reform minister named Henry Crow who came to speak to Latter-day Saints in Utah in 1849 by invitation of Brigham Young. And after Crow preached, Brigham Young said, "Hey, if there's anything here that's true, you need to heed it. You need to listen to what this preacher has just told us." And you fast forward to 1899, and probably one of the most famous American evangelicals in history, Dwight L. Moody, who founded my undergraduate alma mater, Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, he was also invited to speak. It was the second time, actually. So there's been points in history where evangelicals have been invited to speak in not quite a dialogical manner, but I'm sure there were conversations that were had with leadership in Latter-day Saints. But it really isn't until specifically the early 1990s that you begin to see evangelicals and Latter-day Saints want to set aside their impulses to convert because both movements are very missional, engaging in proselytizing, right? So if you have two sides that are trying to convince each other to join their theological tribe, you're always going to have a difficult time speaking. So in the early 1990s, there was a movement of Latter-day Saint and evangelical scholars that said, well, why don't we just sit down and talk and try to really understand each other? And you see from the fruit of those early dialogues, a number of works that begin to be produced. Like Stephen Robinson sits down, who was a LDS scholar at BYU. He sits down with Craig Blomberg, who's a New Testament scholar from Denver, and they author a book called How Wide the Divide in 1997. And to my knowledge, that book represents the first time two academics from both sides set aside that missional impulse to really discuss, to have true interfaith dialogue. And then you have in-person dialogues as well that were started by a guy named Greg Johnson. And we could probably talk about him later because he's instrumental to the story behind this. But listeners may be familiar with the Richard Mouw and Robert or Bob Millett dialogues that took place for nearly 20 years, as far as I understand. And that produced a lot of works too, right? I think of New Mormon Challenge in 2002 that was published by Zondervan. So here's a bunch of evangelicals that were taking Latter-day Saints scholarship seriously for the first time instead of just writing diatribes and apologetic and missionary works against Latter-day Saints. They were taking doctrine and history and practices seriously. Bob Millett and a Anglican scholar named Gerald McDermott wrote a book in 2007 called Claiming Christ, which is a really good one. Mao wrote his own book from his experience in 2012 called Talking with Mormons, and then Mao and Millett kind of capped off that dialogue with a book called Talking Doctrine. I think it was published in 2015. But even as recently as just a few months ago, a dialogue participant from BYU, Grant Underwood, wrote a book called Latter-day Saint Theologies Among Christian Theologies. And in the preface and the foreword, Richard Mouw and Craig Blomberg, with Grant Hardy, attribute all of the hard work that they had put in for the previous 20 or so years into being able to create this systematic theology of traditional Christianity that lays Mormonism alongside of it. So there's quite a bit of work that precedes my book, and then there's parallel works to it too. I think if Chris Thomas's A Pentecostal Reads the Book of Mormon, he was, to my knowledge, the founding president of the Book of Mormon Studies Association. So there's always been the odd ducks, the evangelicals, the traditional Christians who are interested in Mormonism, beyond that kind of missional impulse to convert, if that makes sense.
Now, how does 40 Questions About Mormonism compare to earlier evangelical Latter-day Saint books, some of which you've mentioned?
Yeah, I think by and large, the earlier books that I mentioned are co-authored exchanges between Latter-day Saints and evangelicals. So essentially, these are conversations that readers get glimpses into that are between scholars. Whereas my book is, it's just me. It's a single author work. And my goal here is to create a reliable resource for lay people and seminary students or pastors. I think too, in the earlier era, and what a theme that I notice in these earlier books is that um, you can sense the tension of trying to minimize differences for goodwill. Um, and maybe we kind of like don't talk as much about our differences, or if we do, you come to an impasse. And what I was trying to do is hold the tension between those two opposites, right? To create some kind of charitable precision that could be trustworthy. Um, you know, as an evangelical learning about Mormonism, I liken it to studying and learning a foreign language. And so as a Latter-day Saint reads the book, hopefully they understand what I'm saying, even if I don't get the idioms right and my accent is funny at times. It's still, you can tell it's a good faith effort, and I'm trying and I'd like to improve. And being bilingual theologically, I'm then able to turn around to my own folks and interpret. And frankly, I don't think I could have written 40 questions about Mormonism were I not the beneficiary of more than 20 years of interfaith dialogue, not to mention primary sources. So I relied very heavily on the Joseph Smith papers, and authors that have come before me did not have that privilege. I think if you're writing on Joseph Smith today, you have one of the greatest advantages of any author that's come before you because of that project. So that was indispensable. Um, so yeah, I would say that earlier books are more like watching events if unfold, whereas 40 Questions is more of a resource for people that want those events to continue on.
Now, this is kind of a sort of a meta question. What do you think that academics could observe about ideas about interfaith dialogue or just interfaith dialogue in general from your book?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. One of the things I hope that because it takes a lot of self-reflection. Um, and as a scholar who's trying to straddle two sides of the fence, right? So both the academic scholarly side of things, but also the practical lay side of things. What I hope is that people would sense that methodological self-awareness, I guess, for lack of a better word. I do engage in Latter-day Saint scholarship. Um, I don't just go to the primary sources and then assume I know what the earliest Latter-day Saints were thinking and saying. I engage with secondary sources. I engage with contemporary sources as well. Um, I think also I hope that it would spark conversations about like insider outsider dynamics in interfaith scholarship. So you can almost read this book in at like a 30,000 foot view from a meta perspective. Like you're watching a traditional Christian scholar try to explain to fellow scholars and traditional Christians what Latter-day Saints believe and where they came from and their practices in those types of things. So you can almost read it in two ways. I can't remember the essay. C.S. Lewis has got a great little essay about the limitations of our knowledge, where Meditations on a Woodshed, where he says like approaching a text is kind of like seeing a beam of light in your shed in your backyard. As you enter into it, you can clearly look at the beam of light, but as you approach it and you look up to where the source of the beam of light comes from, you can only look along it. You can no longer look at it. And so in some senses, I would hope that scholars would take both of those views to look along this work that I've written, but then I know full well it would be really interesting to look at it, and like looking at me as I'm writing these things, if that makes sense.
Now, I know you've done a lot of in-person dialogue with Latter-day Saints. How does sort of like lived religion play a part in some of your descriptions?
For sure. That yeah, I think number one, I tried very hard not to treat Mormonism as just a set of theological propositions and to incorporate as much as I could stories or examples, especially throughout history. So, for example, the chapter on proxy baptism begins with Joseph Smith's sermon about the possibility of post-mortem redemption through the ordinance of baptism. And Sarah Nygren, I think was her name, was the first woman, first Latter-day Saint to my knowledge, to be baptized as a proxy for her deceased son in the Mississippi River. So I don't want to just treat Mormonism as a theological topic. I also want people to see the people that were a part of it. I think I do something similar with King Follett. I don't just jump into the doctrine. I talk about how King had died when a tub of rocks fell on his head when he was digging a well. Like there's real people behind this, and with as limited word space as I had, I at any instance I tried to be able to show people how it's lived. I also engage with Latter-day Saint practices, so temples, ordinances, family, community. I think evangelicals are mainly a people of a historical theology. So we like to think about Reformation theology through to today. Like our heroes are Martin Luther and John Calvin, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, J.I. Packer. We don't really necessarily see ourselves as being part of their story, more so we're a part of their theology. But I find with Latter-day Saints, it's actually the reverse. If evangelicals are people of a historical theology, Latter-day Saints are people of a theological history. Like they see themselves in line as history unfolds. Like they're part of the next chapter in the next story. So I think helping evangelical readers understand why history is so important to Latter-day Saints was a major goal in this book.
What chapter was the hardest to write and why?
Oh boy, it was absolutely hands down the chapter that I saved for last. It was the chapter on Joseph Smith. That was such a difficult chapter to write because I he's such a complicated guy, and I'm writing from a perspective that generally you would expect me to want to only treat Joseph with some mode of opposition or even hostility. But what I did was and it took me a long time to do this, but I sat down and I intentionally read through as much of the Joseph Smith papers as was available to me at the time to try to understand the day-to-day Joseph. And what I found was a really complicated man, one who I theologically disagree with at many points, but at other points I couldn't deny that he had a a sincere love for the the community that he was trying to build. I mean, it's you read his journals and he's complaining that he has so many people to over at his house that he can't get any work done. He's barely got time for his own family, and yet he calls that a blessing. I think Joseph Smith was more hospitable than I am, and that was a convicting thing to read. You see, and as a pastor, knowing the things that he had to do allowed me to empathize with him a bit. I remember coming across one moment in his journals where he consoled a woman who had lost a child to a stillbirth on Christmas Eve, the day before the celebration of receiving a gift from heaven, and yet she's weeping and parting with that child. And I doubt, I have no doubt that he was a part of the funerary arrangements. And I've done funerals for children, and you never forget them. He also visited people during an outbreak in Nauvoo. So he he was pastoral in that sense, and yet there's other things he did that I completely disagreed with. Right? The first vision is quite the rupture from my tradition. Polygamy is a really difficult thing to read and to see unfold. So it was a really hard chapter to write charitably from a traditional Christian perspective.
Which chapter was the easiest to write and why?
I think the easiest chapter for me to write was the second to last chapter, maybe. So we're talking about, I'm closing the book with two chapters that are kind of asking the question, so what? So we've gone through history and doctrine practices, and we know the story now, we know the beliefs. So what do we do with this? And essentially what I was able to do with those last couple of chapters was in a pastoral way, give pastoral advice for what would be the best kind of dialogue you could you could experience now that you're equipped with this knowledge and this understanding. So that's probably the most um, practical of the chapters, basically like do's and don'ts. But I found it to be easy because it's just my opinion about how things should be done. So you kind of get to wax eloquent off of your experience, and that's what I drew on was my experience with interfaith dialogue in Latter-day Saints, stretching back to 2013 was the first time I'd ever sat down and had a formal dialogue with any Latter-day Saint.
When you finish the chapters at first, you asked for some Latter-day Saints kind of inputs. So you gave chapters to people. How did that help with the book, or did that fine tune anything?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The book wouldn't be what it is without input and feedback and criticism that I got from Latter-day Saints that I trusted. Uh, so I made a habit early on of releasing drafts of the chapters, not full drafts. I don't think the publishers would have appreciated that, but as much as I could out into the public, and I would blog it, let it sit out there live for a couple of weeks, send it specifically to folks that I know who are Latter-day Saint to ask for their feedback. And I mean, I did that for a year and a half, and I can count on one hand the instances where somebody just flat out told me no, or I don't. It's mainly because I just don't have time. So I had a ton of feedback from Latter-day Saints that weren't afraid to tell me, I see what you're trying to do here, but I don't think you're right. Or I think this is what you're trying to say, but this is the way it sounds to us. So they helped me a lot with fine tuning, even down to things that I just, I knew I needed to talk about, but I didn't have a good enough grasp, and I didn't want to create a caricature or lie unintentionally. And that ranges from anything from like how do you understand um, the subjective experiences that you encounter when you read the Book of Mormon to the more mundane ecclesiological questions like how is a ward set up? What is a bishop's role? Why are there two sets of 70? Isn't that technically 140? Right? So it was a lot of those types of questions that I had a lot of help with. And I will say, related to that, one chapter that I knew I wanted to write, and it was a non-negotiable that it needed to be in the book, was the diversity of Mormonism. So I have a chapter devoted to Community of Christ, the Church of Jesus Christ, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Strangite, and fundamentalism in Denver Snuffer. I think this is probably one of the things that is least understood about Mormonism from an outsider's, especially traditional Christian's perspective, is that Mormonism is not just the church headquartered in Salt Lake City. And so I wanted to ensure that those stories were in there as well.
Now, you said this would kind of fit into graduate education. Where do you see that happening in like a classroom, or is this more like just a kind of an area studies kind of thing for graduate students, or
It could be. I think it would be. I think if you have like religion in America classes or world religions classes, or if you're in one of those classes and you kind of want to fine tune the topic that you're researching on, this would be a resource for them. This is very introductory. So if readers are expecting groundbreaking research or new theories and theses, you're barely going to get it. I think I do make a handful of novel observations, or I try to persuade like historical episodes one way or another from my perspective, but those are pretty few and far between. Um, this this certainly fits along the lines of like a student's introduction to a topic, for specifically for traditional Christians and more specifically evangelicals. And yet at the same time, I was keenly aware that Latter-day Saints would be reading over my shoulder. And so I had them in mind as well as I was writing.
now I've asked you a few questions here. Is there something I should have asked but I didn't?
Um, that's a great question. Maybe uh, next projects, or
Yeah,
I don't know. Typically, how would we end?
what are you doing next, Kyle?
Yeah, so I'm midway through writing a second book with another publisher where I am surveying the development of doctrine and practices that are unique to Mormonism during the life of Joseph Smith. So I'm in the Kirtland era right now, and we're getting to temples. And my goal with this book, similar to some of the things I did in 40 Questions, was to contextualize that development with the story of the Latter-day Saints. So again, I am convinced that, and this book is towards an evangelical audience. I'm convinced that evangelicals seem obsessed with theology because we see ourselves as a people of a historical theology where the story doesn't really affect the development of the doctrine. I don't think that's true. I don't think, and I think that's especially untrue when it comes to Latter-day Saints. So I want to tell the story and then take doctrinal um, doctrines that are unique to Mormonism and to show how they developed, especially just because it's on my mind, temples. Boy, that's very different. We don't have physical temples. We don't have temple ordinances. We don't have ceremonies. We don't have an endowment. So where did all of those things come from? And then I kind of give readers a traditional Christian perspective on why we may or may not align with whatever the topic is, right? So why don't we? So here's why Latter-day Saints have temples. Here's the story. Here's the theology behind it. And here's why we don't. And again, it's not for persuasion's sake so much as it is for informing. After that, I would really like to write on Strang's movement. I would like to write a short biography of Wingfield Watson. Um, there is so much in that area that I have yet to do. So I'm hoping to be able to pivot at least one book back into that area of expertise of mine.
Do you have any collaborators, special people you'd like to acknowledge or thank before we go?
Yeah, I have quite a few. I mean, including yourself, Catherine. You've always been a friend of mine, and always good company, especially at John Whitmer. I really enjoy the relationships and friendships that I've developed there, for straying stuff. Vicky Speak and Amy Derogatis and Bill Shepard come to mind. They've always been kind, and that community is so small. It feels more like fellowship than and friendship than collaboration. And then in the interfaith space, I have a good friend named Stefan Tager who presently teaches at BYU, and we often have private dialogues and conversations. And I owe him a debt of gratitude, or a debt of gratitude for giving space and time to me and being patient with me as we work through things. Um, I'm about to take a group of students from Alabama out to Utah to have interfaith dialogues, and one of those will have is at Stefan's house. So his hospitality is great as well. There's too many to be able to recognize, but I would say that those are the highlights for me.
Now, if people want to get in touch with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, I have a little blog that's at kylebeshears.com. And then there's an About Me tab. You can find an email address that'll get to me if you want to reach out, or you can just find me on social media on Facebook. And I'm pretty good about interacting with folks if they wanted to ask questions or dialogue back and forth a little bit. I try to be very uh, try to stay on top of those friend requests and DMs. So
Well, you've been very gracious with your time, Kyle. Thank you for joining us today.
thanks, Catherine.
We want to thank you for tuning in to the Whitmercast. John Whitmer Historical Association is an educational nonprofit institution. For more information, visit www.jwha.info, where you can meet our team and join the association, read past issues of the JWHA Journal, and get updates on upcoming conferences and events. Our theme music is I Love to Tell the Story, composed by Tom Moraine. This podcast is a production of John Whitmer Historical Association, all rights reserved.